Welcome. You made it through the rain. I'm sure there's a song about that and the wilderness and all that. But my name is Catherine Baker. I'm director of the UC Student and Policy Center, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today. Thank you for coming and for joining us for a great discussion. I'm going to say a little bit about the center, some upcoming events we have, and then personal anecdote to introduce our program. So this UC Student and Policy Center is a new initiative and presence of the University of California in the state and with policymakers. A couple of fun facts about the university: it is the third largest employer in the state of California. And they have faculty experts, researchers, innovation labs, institutes, and students who are working on research in every aspect of modern life. And they have a presence in every single county, assembly, and Senate and congressional district, well beyond the campuses that we have in the state of California. And its public service mission is to be of help and support to policymakers in the state as they tackle the challenges and issues facing Californians. And this center is a very real and concrete way in which we do that. We have great programs where we're just the public square and get to have great debates and conversations. And then we also have policy topics like today, where we want to make sure that the research and expertise of the University of California and our higher education friends at other institutions like USC are able to connect and help engage in topics that matter so that policymakers can make better decisions. We let them deal with the politics. We try to work on facts and good ideas. And so today's program is a part of that. Before we get to today's program, I'll tell you a little bit about some upcoming programs here at the center. We want to make sure that you mark your calendar. A month from today, in March, which will be here before you know it, we will have the next in our California Leaders Speaker Series featuring Antonio Villaraigosa, former speaker, former mayor of California, mayor of Los Angeles. Boy, the Dodgers fans are never going to let me live that down. That will be moderated by Melanie Mason from Politico. Our California Leaders Series is a series of conversations with prominent leaders from across the state. We've had Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. We've had former Controller Betty Yee. We also had then Pro Tem of the Senate, Tony Atkins. Just last week, we had Senator Brian Jones and Assemblymember James Gallagher. And of course, we have to make sure that we get, again, a Dodgers fan. So we are going to have Antonio Villaraigosa. That'll be a great conversation about his leadership journey, what he sees are the challenges facing California, what are his ideas for working on that. So we encourage you to join us. Of course, lunch will be provided, and who knows, it could be burritos or something fun. We'll come up with that. I also want to encourage you to sign up to Politico's playbook. If you're not getting it every day already, you should be getting it because our moderator, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment, is also the author of the climate newsletter. I encourage you to check that out. So here's the QR code for doing that. I'm very fancy. I'm putting that up for you so you can check it out and sign up. We'll put that back up later today as well. And please email ucspcinfo@ucdavis.edu to make sure that you can RSVP for our events and get on our newsletter. We'll have a QR code someday too, and that'll be very important. So today's program is a bit near and dear to my heart because I grew up in the Coachella Valley. If you do that, you're called a desert rat. I promise you it is a term of endearment. Actually, when I was my dad used to ski on the Salton Sea. Obviously, this was back in the early 60s, I'm sure. And one of the last camping trips that we took with the motorhome was down at the Salton Sea when I was in 4th grade. It was a different experience. I also worked for the congressman who represented that area for many years, Congressman Sonny Bono, who made a priority the redevelopment, more for recreation, of the Salton Sea. And that was back in the mid-90s. And so for many years, the Salton Sea and what is its possibility? What is the resource that it provides to the state and to the people around that community has always been a question in my mind. And raise your hand if you've ever been down to the Salton Sea. Okay, wow, that is great. And raise your hand if you think there's got to be more potential, more that can happen down there. It's a great resource. And it has so many communities nearby that have been deeply affected by its challenges over the years, including Native American tribal lands and folks who have been there for many years. And so today's conversation is what are the possibilities and how can that area be optimized in a way that is equitable and a benefit to Californians and beyond. And so to help us with that conversation are the authors of Charging Forward Lithium Valley. We have also Books for you were supposed to arrive, but there have been some delivery challenges. So we have book plates that will be signed for you today, and we'll gather your information if you would like, and we'll make sure that the publisher will get to you on that and follow up. But today's program is by the authors, and I'm just going to go right to the back to introduce them. They were so profusive in their descriptions. We have Chris Benner. He's director of the Institute for Social Transformation and the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change at UC Santa Cruz. Go Banana Slugs. And he lives in Santa Cruz, California. Manuel Pastor is director of the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. It's okay to say, go Trojans, fight on. And author of State of Resistance. He lives in Los Angeles. And today, we have Blanca Begert, who is going to be our moderator today. There will be some time for questions, but right now, I turn it over to our great program. Thank you for coming. Let's welcome them.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks everyone so much for being here. I'm Blanca Begert. I interviewed Chris and Manuel back in December for the California Climate Newsletter for Politico, and I'm so excited to be here talking with them again about their incredibly insightful book. So, as Catherine said, the Salton Sea is that area is a really fascinating area, and as you guys lay out in your book, it's at a really critical inflection point right now where there's, the opportunity to potentially deliver with lithium something that could really benefit local communities, but that involves getting a lot of things right. And I think your book does just such an amazing job kind of explaining the history and the government policies and the social movements that have led us to this moment there, and also does a great job situating it kind of in the energy transition writ large and the supply chain. So I just want to ask, to start off, what drew you guys to this area and made you decide to write this book?
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for that question, Blanca, and great to be here with you. So I also had a connection to the Salton Sea as a child growing up, and so I had a deep interest in the desert and the beauty of that area and the people living there. We were invited in to look at economic development opportunities in the region by a group called Alianza Coachella Valley. A woman named Sylvia Paz is the executive director of that organization. And she's been leading a region-wide effort to create a vision for the Salton Sea, both Imperial County and particularly the eastern Coachella Valley, that promotes environmental regeneration with social equity. And really looking at economic opportunities for the predominantly low-income Latino residents of that region. So at that point, we had just completed what was then our 5th book together called Solidarity Economics, which is all about how to promote mutuality and economic equity. And didn't know anything about lithium and the opportunities in the region. But as we started talking to Sylvia and understanding the opportunity, she's the one who introduced us to that. Sylvia went on to become the chair of the so-called Lithium Valley Commission, the Blue Ribbon Commission on Lithium Extraction. And that really opened the whole window to this incredible opportunity, and seeing really Imperial County and that region as a microcosm of the broader questions around equity and environmental justice that we face as a global society as we transition to green energy.
So that was the official story. It actually started over martinis in Palo Alto as we were trying to figure out what to do next. And I'll say a little bit more about the origins. I'll let you know if I'm talking and my voice is kind of scratchy. It's because I have the same voice condition as Robert Kennedy Jr. It's called spasmodic dysphonia. I promise not to take over your health care or deny you life-saving vaccines. And it gets treated once a month, this is true, with Botox, which is why I look so damn good. And kind of makes your voice kind of tired and scratchy. If you think about what we're facing in the United States right now, a crisis of multiracial democracy. Haven't had it for too long, and folks are trying to snatch it away. A crisis of economic inequality, in which over the last 40 years, the 1% has run away from the rest of us, and now is poised to run away more. And a climate crisis in which we are cooking our planet without thinking about the future. You can think about all those three big crises and how they're connected. But you can also try to say, how can we make this more concrete and specific in a particular locality? And man, Imperial Valley is it. This is a place that is host to the Salton Sea, an environmental disaster zone where Katerina's father should not ski there now, because certainly it would be toxic. It's a place which is an environmental justice disaster zone, where the childhood asthma rate is 2 to 3 times the national average because of the playa or sand that blows off and infects folks. It's been long a place of labor exploitation, the agricultural industry, controlled by its own local oligarchy, rooted in control of water and land. It's been a place where it's now 85% Latino. And yet, Latinos remain close to poverty and far from power. So it's got all of those elements of the crisis of multiracial democracy, lack of representation, inequality, climate and environmental problems. And it's sitting on enough lithium now to redo the entire American auto fleet and have 100 million batteries left over. With tremendous excitement from environmentalists who say it's the cleanest, greenest method of extracting lithium. And so Ed Soja once wrote an article called It All Comes Together in Los Angeles, trying to say that the future of urban America and urbanity in the world was LA. But in a way, it all comes together in the Imperial Valley. And that's what prompted us to write this book, both the specificities and interesting particularities of this place, but also that it was a stage for thinking about these interconnected crises and whether or not there really was a path to just transition.
Thanks for sort of setting the scene of that place. One of the things that you talk about in the book, I mean, obviously there's so much opportunity there with, enough lithium, like you said, to power the entire auto fleet. And Gavin Newsom called it the Saudi Arabia of lithium. But also in the book, you trace just the history of the region, the economic booms and busts that have come there, this history of environmental injustice, and also industries that have kind of promised jobs and all this local benefit that hasn't really panned out, including the solar industry. And I want to, it sounds like, the people at Comité Cívico del Valle and you guys think that there's potential to do something actually different with lithium. So I want to ask why and sort of what would that be?
Well, first I'll say I laugh every time I hear that reference to the Saudi Arabia of lithium, because of course the reference is to the wealth that Saudi Arabia has, not to the human rights abuses that are part of that. But I think it does crystallize some of the questions. And just to back up a bit too, to talk about the broader transition in the globe, because it isn't just lithium. It's a whole series of other critical minerals that are part of batteries and electric vehicles. It's nickel, manganese, cobalt, copper, rare earth minerals. We're really looking at a shift from extracting fossil fuels to extracting mineral resources and the whole global economy rooted in that. And so the question is, can we do it better this time, given 100 years of knowledge of what we've done wrong with the fossil fuel economy? And we could talk more about that history. But part of why we think it's different this time is this is an industry that was in part created by the public, public policies in California around zero emission vehicles and tax credits. It's an industry in part created by consumers, the broader public in California that care about environmental issues and care about green energy and green vehicles. And so there's a lot of attention and state power, to put it any differently, about how to do this right. And I think perhaps more importantly, there's a very strong network of community organizations and labor organizations with deep histories in Imperial County and the Eastern Coachella Valley who've been working around issues of environmental justice, political rights, political power building for decades, who are really lifting up the challenges of doing this right in the industry, making sure the extraction happens in a clean way that is ensuring local benefits, local hiring with decent jobs and wages, and also figuring out how to have the leverage of lithium support more jobs in the value-added parts of the supply chain, in battery manufacturing, maybe even electric vehicle manufacturing in the region. Battery recycling also is a major employment sector in the industry. And so there's people on the ground who really have the leverage and the power and the visibility, entering conversations and negotiations with the companies and the local officials of the area, combined with some of the state attention and broader consumer attention. I think it is very different than when you look at the origins of the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel cars. It's what gives us hope.
So one of the great things about writing a book is when it arrives, and it actually has kind of a new book smell. It's pretty exciting. And we really like the cover. Chris, can you show the cover? It's a beautiful cover. And believe it or not, I've always made a joke that about our books that there's a major motion picture about to be made. But in this case, there's actually 2 documentaries that are being made that center the book. So it's really exciting. But one of the frustrating things is you realize there's some things you should have said in the book that you forgot to say in the book that come to you afterwards. And one is that the history of the Salton Sea region is a history of scams, schemes, and scoundrels. The sea itself is formed from a canal that was hastily built to evade U.S. regulations. They ran it through Mexico to bring water into the Imperial Valley to create an agricultural industry. The canal broke, and for 2 years they could not fix it, and it wound up flooding the Salton Sink to create a sea. The place was actually renamed. It was called the Colorado Desert, which of course did not sound that good to farmers, so they renamed it Imperial Valley. The developments that took place once the Salton Sea came into being included the North Shore Yacht Club, which no longer has yachts. It's not even really much of a club. It was put together by a guy called Ray Ryan, who was eventually shot by the mafia for cheating in a card game. Scams, schemes, scoundrels. Agriculture was supposed to bring a bonanza of wealth, but it seemed to bring an era of exploitation. The solar industry was supposed to create jobs, but instead there were worries that it was a net job killer because of losing agricultural land. So what that means is that a lot of community-based organizations are wary of folks showing up and saying, this time it's different. This time we mean it. We're really going to help you. And so there's been a lot of wariness about the promises that are being made around local employment, about whether or not it really is clean and green, or whether it's going to utilize a lot of water and have a lot of waste. And another phrase we didn't put in the book, but has become quite salient as we've talked about the book, is the need for this region to balance moving at the speed of the market. Because to try to develop this, you got to move fast. And the speed of trust. Because in a place that's been racked by so much division and disempowerment and dislocation, it takes a long time to build trust in the community and get them to want to go along with this, even if corporations and government officials are eager to move ahead. So speed of market versus speed of trust. We're optimistic just because we're always optimistic. We think the world can be better. But for the world to be better, it's going to require a lot of hard work, not just technically in terms of making direct lithium extraction, which Chris can explain a little bit more, actually viable, but making the political coalitions necessary, actually what's called in Spanish factible, realistic, that can actually happen.
Can you talk a little bit, I guess, about what that kind of looks like? I mean, you know, you say that there are these there is more organized community and people who are aware of kind of the history here, and you know, I know there was like the Valle Unido coalition that launched that has sort of more organizing across the supply chain and has new types of demands on the companies there, and also, but you know, and there's also been fights with environmental justice and a lawsuit that they brought against the companies, and I guess I'm curious, like, kind of how that's working out right now, like the actual as these things are being negotiated, kind of where we're at this moment.
Can you start with the corporate players as well as the community players?
Okay, makes sense. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, there are three major corporations that are proposing and developing lithium extraction sites in the area. Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, also known as Cal Energy as a division of them, is the largest player. They have 10 geothermal plants. There's another company called Energy Source Minerals, which has ties to another geothermal plant. And then the newcomer on the block is Controlled Thermal Resources, originally an Australian company that is now relocated to Imperial County in the US, that is developing a new geothermal plant that's directly connected with lithium extraction and has plans for building a battery plant, or at least space for it, integrated there. They all have somewhat different strategies. And then Blanca mentioned this new coalition that has come together in the region called the Valle Unido Coalition. Comité Cívico del Valle is a long-standing environmental justice organization that's been working in the area for decades. There's a group relatively new called the IV Equity, Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition. One of the significant players in this Valle Unido condition, though, is the United Auto Workers. And it's an interesting story because if you think about the fossil fuel industry and the auto industry, you know, the UAW was critical for ensuring that those jobs in the auto industry were living wage jobs and really created the middle class in the US. But they got there through both, you know, sitting down, stopping production in the 1930s, having a major sit-down strike, and then sitting down with the employers and negotiating a contract that ensured their benefits. And that actually set the stage for a whole series of other industries and really created the middle class in the US through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But one of the compromises they made in that negotiations was that they left the decisions about technology and investment in new plants up to management. And that paved the way for outsourcing and offshoring and move to non-union locations in southern states. Well, now the UAW has created a center for manufacturing in the green economy, which is really trying to get ahead of the curve in the electric vehicle industry and looking at what are the infrastructure needs, what are the training needs, what are the incentives that can be put in place to help bring new manufacturing to disadvantaged regions, but ensuring that it builds from a union base from the bottom up. So they're a key player in that coalition as well. There's another group called Jobs to Move America, which really cut its teeth in building community benefits agreements and living wage ordinances in Los Angeles. And actually it was critical in having the first community benefits agreement signed with an electric vehicle manufacturer in the US. It was electric bus manufacturer, BYD, from China, actually. And they are busy organizing in southern states in some of the new battery factories that have been built there. They're a key player now in Imperial Valley as a newcomer, but with a lot more experience and connection to that industry. So they're busy negotiating now with the employers from the very beginning of the industry to ensure community benefits rather than coming on, you know, 2-3 decades later after the industry was started, which is what happened in the auto industry.
And the only thing I would add to that is that one of the tensions that exist is that there's a couple tensions, but one is that a lot of the county officials also want community benefits, but are not necessarily making them mandatory. And what the community groups and labor unions want is for mandatory community benefits, which has to do with signing actual contracts with the manufacturers that mean that they actually have to deliver on those promises rather than sort of vague suggestions that they will actually hire locally, et cetera. The other thing which I think is critical in this mix, and again, it gets back up to the scale of what do we need to do generally, is that community-based organizations, labor unions, have to combine in this particular moment power building, having enough power to force their way onto the table, the sit-down strike, with economic expertise, trying to figure out how the industry works, how it pencils out, exactly how much you can demand. And that is an unusual combination to combine power building, community organizing with economic expertise. And it's particularly important because there are not that many jobs in lithium extraction. The real jobs are in battery assembly, EV assembly, battery recycling, going up the supply chain. So the question is, how can you leverage the local lithium and extraction to say, well, it's going to be cheaper to have a battery plant here. And that's going to require a level of sophistication that you don't want just lodged in the county, but also in the community groups, in the labor groups as well. And those are some of the tasks that are there in front of these organizations.
Yeah, I think that was such a big takeaway from your guys' book is just how it has to be so much more than just lithium extraction itself, for there to actually be like jobs and these types of benefits. And I'm curious, I mean, I know that some of the like Lithium Valley draft plans and stuff have outlined like we need other types of pieces of the supply chain, but is that happening? Like, do you guys see that kind of really happening there?
Well, I think it's all remaining to be seen. I mean, it's a process that's unfolding right now. And I'll lift up two things that are connected to what you said. You know, one is there is a process underway of it's called a Lithium Valley specific plan. Actually, the state allocated $5 million to Imperial County, a variety of processes, to both do specific industrial planning for this site around the geothermal plants, and to create what's called a programmatic EIR, Environmental Impact Report, which is designed to streamline the process of approving industrial uses in that area. Because one of the concerns that companies say or have about expanding in California is the long time it takes to get environmental approvals for new projects. And this is a way of trying to streamline that process. So that draft plan was recently released. It's open for public comment right now. You can go to the Lithium Valley Specific Plan site. If you Google it, you'll find it there, and there's lots of space for public comment on it now. And so people are thinking actively about those other stages of the value chain and figuring out how do we build the infrastructure, how do we get the rail lines to be extended to where the plants might be, how do we get the electricity in that's needed for those facilities. One concern I have about that is it's a specific geographic area, about 50,000 acres right around the geothermal plants. But I actually think we need to be thinking about that whole Imperial County and Coachella Valley region, because that's a much broader labor force that's going to be needed to draw for major manufacturing enterprises. There's actually 3 million people just across the border in Mexico and Mexicali that is actually an important workforce as well that could be integrated into sort of an industrial complex that it could include all steps of that supply chain. They're only talking about the earliest level of commercial extraction of lithium at this point is probably, late 2026 at the very earliest, probably into 2027. And if you're going to be able to leverage that lithium with any additional added value in the value chain, it'll come after that. So, there's nothing immediately on the ground now, but lots of people are planning for it and building for that. I will mention there's lots of ups and downs in the lithium market. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when we first really started looking at this, the price of lithium was as much as almost $80,000 a metric ton on global markets. It's now down to about $10,000 So that totally changes the investor's calculation about the payoff over time on that. So I think things have slowed down a bit as they're beginning to look at the balance of supply and demand in global lithium markets.
The thing I would add to that is that in the long, it's pretty easy also to think in this current moment with the election of Donald Trump that somehow EVs will be, a thing of the past, and we will go back to gas guzzlers as a statement of American manhood. But there's a couple of things which I think are really crucial here. One, of course, is Elon Musk and his influence and how that will support electric vehicle markets going forward. Second is that the auto manufacturers are pretty far along already with lots of investments in battery plants, EV assembly, and understanding a little bit like the CEO of ExxonMobil, who after Trump got elected said, wait a minute, slow down, let's not pull out of the Paris Accords, because, eventually we will have to lower the carbon footprint. So I think the auto manufacturers know that. Third, there's all sorts of, if you look at the geography of who's gotten the benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act, it's southern states, because that's where all the battery assembly, battery manufacturing, or nearly all of it, there's a couple places in the Midwest, has gone. And so there's going to be political constituencies who will deny climate change, but welcome climate investments. And then fourth, the Chinese auto manufacturers who are nipping at the heels. Now, they may not be able to enter into the U.S. market if the U.S. can raise tariffs high enough against them. But they will enter into Latin America, Africa, Asia, parts of Europe with vehicles that are very high quality at this point and are coming in at $20,000 and even $10,000. And so that pressure is going to lead U.S. auto manufacturers to want to continue to move forward. There will be demand for lithium. This is just to make sure that you do read the book and understand how relevant it still is.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I guess, a little bit more about that. I mean, that's a good point that that Lithium Valley will still be a thing, and they'll still be trying to mine lithium there. But I guess I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how Donald Trump and this current federal administration might change things in whatever ways that it might for Lithium Valley. Like obviously he loves mine, but is going after EV policies and money and that I don't know if anyone was in the CEC workshop today, but they were talking about how like a downturn in demand for EVs had caused some Australian mines to close or have to be bailed out by their government. One of the controlled thermal resources, one of the companies at the Salton Sea has a conditional $1 billion loan from the energy department, which we don't know. That's going to have to be negotiated. What's going to happen? So, I mean, I know you weren't saying that Trump won't change things at all. Like, I'm curious just how that might affect that area.
Yeah, well, it's hard looking into a crystal ball because, of course, we can't predict the future. But I think a couple things to think about. One is, what Trump says he's going to do and what he actually does. And I think it remains to be seen whether he will actually remove some of the incentives that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, many of which were in the form of tax credits. And major multinational corporations benefit tremendously from those tax credits and new investments. So, that's kind of in his interest and the country's interest to maintain those in place. The visible one that we see a lot is the $7,500 consumer credit for buying electric vehicles. That may go away. Elon Musk thinks that he doesn't need that, that Tesla doesn't need that as much as other electric vehicle companies because they've gotten an advantage and are, have more economies of scale. I think, again, that remains to be seen because there's a lot of other auto companies that really appreciate that consumer tax credit. So, that may go away. So, I think it remains to be seen what's going to actually be done at a federal level. But I think the point that Manuel pointed to is that the industry is already so well advanced that it may not need more federal incentives and subsidies to move ahead. But I think it's tremendously important at early stages of any industry's development. We saw this in the semiconductor industry and computer industry and solar energy, and we see it in lithium, where early public investment is actually critical for developing out the new technologies and new infrastructure, but that ultimately the industries take on a dynamic of their own. And globally, electric vehicles are accelerating. Some of it is the much smaller vehicles, not just more cost-effective automobiles, but motorcycles and the kind of three-wheeled tuk-tuks that you see in India and other places. The European market is growing. And so I think the real question is not so much, it may slow down a little bit, but I think everyone that I've seen is still predicting the electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle industry too, because I think one of the real concerns is the level of charging infrastructure that we have in the US, that is not where it ultimately needs to be, and it may take a while to build that out. But the question is going to be who benefits, right? How much is it going to be, manufacturing in states in the South that, as Manuel says, leaders may not believe in climate change, but they believe in climate investment. But there aren't unions, wages are lower, there are a few worker protections, or the extent to which it happens in California with all the protections that we have in place. The extent to which manufacturing happens even in the US versus in China or other parts of the world. The extent to which lithium comes from California or comes from, hard rock mining in Australia with all the environmental problems that are part of that. So I think that's the real question in my mind, is the equity dimensions, who's benefiting, as well as the pace of development. It might slow down a little bit from where it would have been with the Biden administration, but I think the industry is really continuing to move ahead.
So one thing to add to that, and maybe a little context for those who are not as deep into this, is that there's sort of three ways of extracting lithium. One is hard rock mining, which is pretty environmentally destructive. A second is evaporation ponds. So these are in the desert, these lots of water, the lithium comes to the surface. Again, pretty environmentally problematic. Most of that occurs in South America. It actually also faces challenges from indigenous folks for whom water is a sacred element, and this kind of waste of it is spiritually damaging and not just environmentally damaging. The third method is this direct lithium extraction, which is in geothermal plants. Since you're bringing up the water in the first place, it's brine, it's got a lot of elements in it. There's 3 places in the world where that geothermal brine, they know, is super rich in lithium. One of them is in Imperial Valley, and that's called direct lithium extraction. You can you bring it up, pull out the lithium, re-inject the water. It's not quite as closed loop as I described, but it's a little bit more. It's why they call it the cleanest, greenest method of extracting lithium. I think one thing that Imperial Valley is probably going to do is start to call this mining, because that will lead Donald Trump to think that it's like actual mining, and therefore move ahead on allowing this to move forward. Again, so much of what we see this president do is more symbolic than substantive. There is something, though, that I will mention that I think we should all be worried about, and will have an impact here, which is the systematic dismantling of the federal government and of research. There's no way that we would know about the geothermal reserves without all of the research that's been funded by the Department of Energy. There's no way that this technology would be moving into place without some regulations, without some help, without some policy. And to think about what a seriously disabled federal government can do, particularly when a particularly easy spot for gutting has been the stripping away of research contracts. I mean, you could think about it in terms of your own particular area, education contracts. that have been ripped up, the indirect rates that have been cut without any understanding of what those actually fund in terms of basic scientific infrastructure. So I kind of think this collapse of the federal government and the collapse of research infrastructure will have an impact in multiple locations, but lithium extraction is one of them.
I'm gonna let Blanca ask one or two more questions and then turn it over to you, the audience. And I've got my question waiting in the wings, so go for it.
Okay. Yeah, well, I just had one more question, really. So, I mean, I think, you know, to the point of who benefits, and also just to the point of, I guess, how does California kind of maximize opportunities for the local economy, for the state? What is your guys' advice to policymakers? You know, we've talked about some of the things like making sure that there's more of the supply chain in the region, but I know you had a lot of different ideas in your book. So yeah, what should policymakers be looking at?
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting, that was actually just in this California Energy Commission workshop that was happening this morning, is recognizing that European policies are actually quite a bit ahead of the US, and that California could harmonize its regulations and policies with Europe. And that would be a beneficial thing for companies to be selling here and locating here in California and meet those standards, again, because it would harmonize globally and make it easier to integrate with global markets. One of the components of that is related to sort of traceability and transparency across the whole supply chain. The European Union is putting in a series of policies to make transparent the source of all the minerals that are in batteries, to make it both much easier to ensure that they're extracted in an environmentally friendly way and not abusing child labor and human rights. But actually also knowing the components of the battery is really important for the recycling end of the industry. So if a recycler gets a battery and they don't actually know all the components that are in it, it makes it much harder to extract the particular minerals out to recycle it. And so if you've got this kind of QR code, that makes it really easy to know exactly what's in the battery. So California could put that in place and then link it with a consumer marketing effort to say, get the cleanest, greenest market, lithium on the planet from California, and ensure that electric vehicle companies are building that in as part of their marketing. I think that would help build that. Also, to the extent that we can link in the community benefits and labor issues that are part of that. I'm not a detailed policy person, so I don't know, what powers California has as a state for, domestic content. Because of interstate trading regulations, I don't think you can make specifically California content, but there may be state tax subsidies that can be done that incentivize that kind of sourcing from California sources. And I think, again, integrating across the whole supply chain. And one of the things to keep in mind is battery technology is always developing. And there are new companies in Silicon Valley that are building out solid state batteries. We could go on for a long time about that, about why they're better in a number of different ways. But then integrating the actual manufacturing facilities with the new innovations, I think is really important. And because of the closeness and connection and the importance of that for piloting new production processes, I think there's a lot of potential for that.
I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but states' rights, baby. So I think trying to figure out tax credits for consumers that apply to content produced in California, if there's state tax credit. I think you could think about all sorts of other incentives. I think one thing we haven't mentioned, which is critical, is the rapid development of EV charging infrastructure that's reliable within the state. I think that could be very helpful. And then finally, something people don't think about much, which is where we really need the tax credits, which is a little bit different than what I just said, is in the used EV market. Because really most of the people buying EVs right now are not that price sensitive. They're buying it because they want the technology. I know, I own 2 EVs myself, my wife and I. They're both Bolt electric vehicles because we knew early on that Elon Musk was not an individual whose enterprise we wanted to support. But it turns out that if you could make sure that we take our vehicles and move them down into the secondhand market, you're getting that out to a lot of users who probably live in more polluted areas, could probably actually use the brakes. And how do you move stuff rapidly to the top end and move stuff out into the used car market? That was actually one of the best things of the Inflation Reduction Act, was its development of credits for used cars to be able to move that part of the market and trickle the vehicles down.
Well, Blanca asked my question, which is, right across the building are legislators, and their staff will be saying, okay, what can I do to make California most competitive to optimize this? So thank you for doing that, as well as not answering, you got to buy the book. It's helpful to have so much substance. A couple questions that you may have. Happy to bring the mic to you so it goes on our video recording. I know I've got one question. Yes, in the back, and then we're coming back to you. Thank you. You raised first. It's coming to you.
My name is Diana Williams, and thanks so much. I appreciated your presentation, and I just want to go back to one of the takeaways that I heard you say, and I've heard others say, is that the real community benefit will be in the supply chain, that there's several hundred jobs that would come out of lithium extraction, but if you could build out this whole economy. So I wanted to go back to just drill down on that a little more. What does that look like? You did talk about tax credits, but that really seems to be what has to happen. So is that public investment in the, what I wanted to ask, and maybe the policymakers in the room could answer that question too. Great question.
Chris?
Well, one of the things that I would do if I had time is talk more to the electric vehicle manufacturers. I mean, there's a lot of people talking about starting from lithium and how do you add value added to it. But in fact, it's the auto manufacturers that have a lot of control over their supply chain. And really, California is the home of the electric vehicle industry in the same way that Detroit was the home of the fossil fuel car industry. I mean, it was Tesla that was really driven here. We remain the largest market overall in the US. 1 out of 4 cars that are sold in California today are electric vehicles. And I just got to believe that there are some advantage to auto manufacturers of being located closer to that market for the electric vehicle manufacturers. And Imperial County has a lot of advantages of lower land costs than much of the rest of California, lower electricity costs than much of the rest of the state. It's got a hard-working labor force that is looking for jobs. Unemployment rates in the county are 3 to 4 times the state average. But it's a neglected part of the state that a lot of electric vehicle manufacturers probably just don't know about. And so really understanding what are their needs and what are they looking for to get into that consumer market. We used to have a lot of auto manufacturers in the LA region that then disappeared largely in the 70s and 80s, in part because of increasing prices in the region. And I think this is an opportunity to bring them back into the state. So that's one thing that I would do, is really starting with the electric vehicle companies.
Well, you want to chime in that? Okay, up front.
Is there a concern that a new improved battery technology will come along that doesn't even use lithium and gains a larger market share?
Yes. Sodium batteries have very similar characteristics to lithium, sodium itself in terms of the electronic compositions. But they are not as energy dense, so heavier for the amount of energy that's part of them. So they will likely move into the energy storage system end of the industry before they get into electric vehicles. There are sodium batteries out there now. Actually, China has them in energy storage systems and some in automobiles as well, some of the lighter vehicles. Most of the people in the US are talking more about solid state lithium-ion batteries. They charge faster, they're less flammable, less volatile, they're energy dense, and I think are moving more in that direction. They use about 20 to 30% less lithium per unit of energy, but still a large amount of lithium. So all the predictions that I've seen is there's a demand for lithium, 20, 30 years down the road, despite whatever other technologies that are out there.
Not to that question, but I realized there was one thing I wanted to say about your question, is whatever policies we come up with in the state, to have policy stability. Because I think that's going to be the contrast with DC. DC is whipsawing now. But if and maybe we're on a permanent path to autocracy. But if cooking the planet, there'll be some opposition. Denying the reality of the changing demographics of the United States, there'll be some opposition. Removing people's rights to employment, that without any kind of due process and with no connection to their performance, there might be a reaction. And so we've had a lot of whipping back and forth over the last bunch of years. And it's rare for me to be heartened by the CEO of ExxonMobil saying, wait a minute, don't pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, because they want to slow down what we do if you're a fossil fuel company, but they know it's dying. So I think one thing California can do, at least in my view, and of course there can be political debate about it, is stick with this path to make us the place where EVs will be bought, where EVs, man, I got to assemble it there because the market is there, and there'll be some policy stability.
Great. I'm going to sneak in one more, very selfishly, but we'll do lightning round on this one before signing the book plates. And that is the experience in Monterey County with the lithium battery location by the Elkhorn Slough. And it just yesterday was in the news again because it looks like it might be smoldering and they're under shelter in place in that neighboring community. How much do you feel that's a potential barrier now, is communicating to people that the safety, not only policymakers and their constituents, but we've been talking very much about the effect of this opportunity on the local community. Do you see that as an issue that needs to be added and addressed as well?
The whole supply chain matters for sure. So for people who don't know, the Moss Landing battery energy storage site was the largest energy storage system I've heard in the world, certainly in the country, when it was built, and it had a big fire a few weeks ago. And the question is, look, we know lithium-ion batteries are flammable. That's why you can't check your computer on a plane, right? It's got to be in the cabin with you. The question is, what kind of safety features are put in place? This facility in Moss Landing was a retrofitted natural gas energy facility. Was not designed for batteries. They tried to retrofit it. It also had, this is getting really technical, it had the NMC, nickel, magnesium, cobalt batteries, which are more flammable than newer lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are heavier, but are much less flammable. So, the company didn't do due diligence. They didn't have the right fire protection systems in place, the right monitoring in place, and the local community suffered for that, for sure. So that's a story for me about proper regulation. It's about proper production conditions and making sure companies do it right. It's not a story about we shouldn't be doing battery energy storage systems.
Manuel?
We have a rental property in North Pasadena bordering Altadena. So you might know where the story's going. Fortunately, the front two units survived. My daughter lived in the back unit. She evacuated in time. The fire was put out by the front tenant and his father, who had just lost his home, who rushed to our backyard when it went on fire and tossed water on it. Neighbors came, broke through fences, strung in hoses, etc. So we now have a burned storage shed, burned fences, a burned carport, and 3 burned cars, which we're waiting for the Army Corps of Engineers to remove. Fortunately, they were not EVs. because if they were EVs, they'd still be on fire. So this is something that is going to scare people. It certainly did in Altadena, to recognize that this shiny vehicle that you thought was part of the 21st century was instead your gateway to Hades.
I wanted us to end on a positive note.
I can do that.
Thank you. Real quick closing remarks, and then I'll tell you how to get your book plate signed.
The part of the book that we haven't highlighted a lot in this talk is the incredible stories. I mean, Manuel alluded to it a bit by the guy who built the North Shore Yacht Club and was killed over a poker game. There's lots of other stories in there, and so we hope you'll read it. We wrote it not for an academic audience. We really wrote it for a broader public audience. I think I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would echo that. We keep saying, come for the analysis, stay for the stories. And we actually added, if I can reveal an interesting discipline, we wrote this together, the first draft, in 1 month. Wow. Sitting together. And when we first sat down, what I told Chris was, you cannot use the word thus. Which the copy editor wound up putting a few thuses back in. But it was a metaphor for, and this is an important lesson, started with these big crises we're facing. But another crisis we're facing right now is, how do academics and researchers speak to the public? And what we tried to do in this book, and I got there pretty close, but I dare you to find an ideological sentence. I dare you to find something that uses words that are unnecessary or doesn't quickly go to an image or a story. So this, I think, was tackling a new topic, tackling an important topic, but also experimenting with how do you communicate like normal human beings with a story that entrances as well as it informs.
I would just attest as a normal human being that, and a Salton Sea head and Lithium head, that it was really, there was great stories and characters that I learned a lot that I didn't know before. And so even if you know a lot about this issue or don't, it's a really interesting book. So
Fantastic.
I recommend.
To bring it back around, I'm grateful you wrote this about my home area and the possibilities. Thank you for being our moderator today. Thank you for terrific. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And we really appreciate you coming again. Please email us, ucspcinfo@ucdavis.edu, to get our newsletter. You can also subscribe to the Politico Playbook and the Climate Newsletter. If you would like to have a book plate signed, there are book plates there and a sheet where you can leave your name and email, and the publisher will contact you when they're at Capitol Books, which is a local bookstore right around the corner. Thanks for coming today.